Thank you all for coming. My name's Dane Scott. I direct the Mansfield Ethics and Public Affairs program, and this event is part of the Mansfield Brown Bag Series, Mansfield Center's Brown Bag Series. And so I welcome you here. I think we have a great topic for a noon talk right before lunch. What is good food, or what makes food good? I wanted to tell you we're also having another event next week as part of the Mansfield Center Brown Bag Series, and that's Jason Blackstock is going to talk about geoengineering the climate, technologies for rebalancing and reinforcing global inequity. And then on Wednesday night, he's going to give a talk on managing our living planet, exploring the evolving role of science in public decisions. So I hope you'll keep those in mind as well. And it really is a pleasure to introduce Paul Thompson. Paul's a good friend, something of an academic hero. He's a philosopher that works on things that matter. And he actually is something of a trailblazer in that he has picked topics that other philosophers really haven't focused on, which are extremely important, such as food and agriculture. And he's actually made a very distinguished career out of it. And so we're very fortunate to have Paul here. And Paul is the Kellogg Chair at Michigan State University in Food and Agriculture. And he's worked on many important issues such as sustainability, animal welfare, risk and precaution, and agrarianism. And I wanted to recommend a couple of books to you that I've found really helpful written by Paul. This one is The Spirit of the Soil, Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, and he does have an extremely good discussion in this book on industrial agriculture, very sophisticated discussion, and also the connections between agriculture and environmental ethics. And then his most recent book, which deals a lot with agrarianism and sustainability, called The Agrarian Vision, which is a synthesis of a lot of work that Paul's been doing over the years. And this is the first time Paul's been here during winter. He's been here many summers, and we had a great talk a few years ago at the Peas Farm, where he talked about agrarianism, and it was a great setting for that. And so I'd like you to welcome Paul Thompson.
Thank you. I always really do enjoy coming to Missoula, and it's a pleasure to be here on such a beautiful day. What I'm going to do in this talk is explore some different ways in which we think of food as good, and in some respects it's a kind of a play on the idea that when we're thinking about something being good, we're thinking about it having certain kinds of aesthetic characteristics and also ethical characteristics and also economic characteristics. What I'm going to do is focus on three seemingly somewhat unrelated problems in food ethics, and I'll give you a kind of quick and dirty sketch of each of these problems. And then I'm going to end by suggesting, although I don't think I have a detailed argument for this, that it's actually helpful for seeing these challenges as more closely linked to one another than we typically do. So I'll start out with hunger and food security, and I'll be looking at that primarily from a global perspective, not so much from a U.S. perspective. Then turning to a more U.S. orientation, looking at diet and obesity, and then finally thinking a little bit about some of these food, community, and culture types of questions. So starting out with the focus on food security, I'll point to work by two living philosophers, probably two of the most influential living philosophers. One of them, Peter Singer, who's been influential both for his work on animals, but also for work that he's done throughout his career on world hunger. and Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel-winning economist, but we like to claim him in the discipline of philosophy. He writes very sophisticated philosophy as well. And I'll start out by talking a little bit about Singer's extremely influential work on world hunger, which works out of the idea, a pretty straightforward idea, that people are hungry when they don't have access to sufficient amounts of food. And Singer moves forward into this, developing arguments for why we really have responsibilities for doing something about this. And it suggests that we have, we meaning better off people, well off people, Americans, Europeans, Singer himself is an Australian, have moral obligations to ensure that sufficient food is available globally. And there are essentially two ways that we can think about doing this. One of them is that we can increase farm production, and then secondly, we can offer food aid to people. And Singer's original paper on this back in the 1970s really focused on famine relief, and it focused on making gifts to support food aid to hungry people in the developing world. There is, however, a bit of a problem with Singer's view, and I'm not going to speak in detail about this in the present paper, but it's that access doesn't necessarily equate with availability. You can have food that is available and yet be unable to access it, and that would actually be the situation in most developed countries where there's a hunger problem, as in the United States. There's no shortage of food in the United States, yet we have hungry people because they don't have the resources to purchase food. And Sen developed his analysis by focusing on a famine in Bengal in 1943, in which hundreds of thousands of people suffered from hunger, and many starved, many died, not because there was no food available. There was plenty of food available, but rapid inflation and depression in the price of wages for low-wage workers made that food impossible for them to access. So Sen has developed an alternative analysis, which is that to be capable of having access to food requires having a secure food entitlement. And Sen would argue that there are really three ways to unpack this idea of an entitlement. One is that you can grow it. If you are growing food, then you have a secure food entitlement. But for most of us, we go out and purchase food, and so our food entitlement is based on our income, on our ability to have a sufficient amount of income to buy food. This ties the right to food, or the food entitlement, to the economy in a much larger way, and employment and inflation become critical factors. We can actually unpack this in a little more detail by understanding three kinds of entitlement. One is the direct production entitlement. The second would focus on earned income, and then if you don't have enough income, you might actually get a gift or grant, either of money or some negotiable type of entitlement. We still refer to this as food stamps, even though the U.S. Department of Agriculture has started using alternative terminology, but we have entitlements that allow low-income people to get access to food, or in some cases it's simply charities. The Catholic Church is actually one of the major guarantors of food in many parts of the world through a kind of grant program. So how do these entitlements become secure, and how should we think about this from the standpoint of ethics? Now here I want to focus first on the direct production entitlement. This seems pretty straightforward. You're out there growing food, and if you have a garden, you may be holding a job or doing some other things. But if you're a developing country farmer and food is your primary source of support your subsistence occupation. You are going to grow food and you're going to eat it and feed it to your family, but you need to be able to produce at least a certain amount of cash income from that in order to be a viable farmer. You have to replace your tools. You probably have some other obligations. Occasionally you need to get access to some health care or to some non-food items. And so for farmers, the security of your food entitlement is actually linked to the price of food. If the price of food falls so low that you can't recover the cost that you incur in producing food, then your direct entitlement to food through growing it yourself is actually put into jeopardy. And this becomes especially dramatic if we think about farmers in some parts of the world who are actually growing crops that they can't eat. In Mali, where we have a program at Michigan State, the poor farmers are growing cotton, poor farmers are growing coffee and tea and other kinds of crops that they of course have to sell in order to then convert that into a cash entitlement to access food. So, for farmers, it's good when their prices are high, but the security of an exchange-based entitlement is going to be better. It's going to be more secure when the price of food goes down. If you're buying food, you want food prices to be low. So perhaps it's obvious, but we get into this situation where there's just a direct conflict between the food entitlements that are based on direct production and the food entitlements that are based on earned income. And how do we address this? Well, this is not primarily a philosopher's problem. It's something we think about in terms of economics and policy, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The thing that I need to point out here before that is that actually about half of the poorest people in the world, half of the people who are considered to be in extreme poverty according to World Bank standards. Right now, the World Bank standard for extreme poverty is €1 a day or less. A euro is worth about $1.30. So these are people who are making less than $1.30 a day. About half of these people are farmers. The estimates vary. Some would say that approximately 70% of the poorest people in the world actually depend on farming for their income because they're wrapped up in the farm economy. But at any rate, it's roughly a trade-off between urban poor who depend on food price being down and at least equal numbers of rural poor who would like food prices to be up. So we might address this through a sophisticated program of gifts or grants, but if we're not careful, this can actually make the problem even bigger. And so to understand that a little bit, let's think about how we address this problem in the United States. This is not a very good diagnosis of our food problems. Our producers complain and would like to make more money, but most of them are food secure. Most farmers, the vast majority of farmers in the United States are food secure. So we basically address this through economic growth, through a transition to where we're now to the point where less than 2% of our population, globally 50% of the poor are farmers, but less than 2% of our total population are farmers, and relatively small numbers of them. As a matter of fact, I don't think the census actually indicates significant figures of people who report themselves as being farmers who are in poverty in the United States. So we've kind of grown ourselves out of this, and we've grown ourselves out of this through programs of subsidies. We've subsidized farm production. This tension that I'm describing was real in the United States during the Depression era, and farmers found themselves having to destroy crops in the field in order to keep food prices up. They couldn't recover the cost that they were getting for their production, and so they literally cut down or burned crops in the field, and that was the point at which our current agricultural policies were established so that those crops could come into the marketplace at lower prices be available, and farmers would be able to recover their full costs and continue to farm. As that program matured through the 1950s, we started having extra production, and so we started relying on exporting a lot of that extra production. And we exported it both by selling it, sometimes below the cost that it took that American farmers incurred to actually produce it. The government would subsidize the cost on world markets, and also through our Food for Peace program, which was our primary program of food aid, which gets us back into this international situation where the word that others use is dumping our excess production on global markets, and our excess production is now in competition with that's being produced by this 1/2 of the world's population who are in extreme poverty, making less than $1.30 a day. And it's actually creating a situation in which they can't sell their food. Where many stories, I'm not going to tell these stories in detail here, of cases where food is available during famines locally, and they're unloading the bags that say gift of the United States of America, and the local farmers who then can't sell their food, and they wind up being the victims of the famine rather than the people in the cities. So in many respects, this is what I would call the fundamental problem of food ethics, and it's one that I think needs to be borne in mind as we think about other issues in food ethics. It's not a problem that I think that we have figured out how to solve in economic terms. Meanwhile, we've been producing plenty of food in the United States, and we actually have too much to eat, and that brings me to challenge number 2, which is this idea that we are now starting to see obesity as an ethical problem. Now, obesity has historically been thought of as an ethical issue. In ancient Greece, the idea of temperance, not eating too much, got a number of different treatments, and was something that you see throughout that tradition. It carried over into medieval philosophy with the idea that gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins. And I'm not going to go through all of these points, but here's Pope Gregory the Great's analysis of gluttony. I'm not sure that it matches up quite with our ideas of what the causes of obesity are, but St. Thomas Aquinas also wrote about gluttony, and he associated it with these 5 characteristics, and only one of these really focuses on eating too much. Dainty eating is a form of gluttony for Aquinas. As we move into the modern era, Kant describes the problem of dietary ethics under the heading of duties to oneself. And Kant is focused on the idea that we should strive to realize our rational capabilities, but he recognizes that we have to take care of our bodies. We have to attend to our animal natures in order to do that. Others who follow Kant actually stress the idea that this isn't really a moral responsibility at all, that rational self-control is just a problem of prudence rather than morality, and they want to make a distinction between the idea that this is something that's ethically significant and just something that's kind of common sense prudential behavior. This move actually becomes bound up in an idea that nutrition and bodily health are scientific issues, and that there's really no place for morality in talking about them. Again, I could talk about this in much more detail, but let me just cut to the chase, because we find ourselves today in a situation where we're starting to talk about obesity not just as a matter of self-interest or prudence, but as a social problem. obesity is a key factor for disease, and we're all, as a society, bearing the increased costs that are associated with this. I can relate to this personally, but I won't tell that story right now. So we're starting to see this as something that we need to cope with as a social problem and not simply as a matter of individual prudence. So how do we think about this? Well, here I'm drawing on some recent work by some friends of mine, some Dutch philosophers, and their names are so complicated that I'm not going to try to pronounce them. But they have argued that we really need to understand this by thinking about the links between obesity and responsibility. And we focus first on a sense of causal responsibility. We try to understand what are the causes for this uptick in obesity, right? I mean, as we've seen, there have been, gluttonous people and people who are overweight since antiquity, but this idea that we now have a rise in obesity and it's creating a social problem is something that's recent, and we have to first understand what the causes of this are, and then once we have a diagnosis of the causes, then we can start to think about where the moral or political responsibility would really start to lie. That we're going to primarily understand in terms of who it is that should be doing something about this uptick in obesity. And they come up with an analysis that's remarkably commonsensical for a group of philosophers. They really first focus on three possible causal models. The first is that this is just a problem in individual decisions. People are making bad decisions about what they should eat. The second is that somehow the social environment has caused people to make poor decisions or is encouraging bad behavior. And then finally, they consider the possibility, they actually use this term genes. It's really a little more complicated than just genes, but the idea that there are genetic bases that are tied to physiology, brain chemistry, and that we're actually starting to see some medical causes for the uptick in obesity. Now, if it's primarily a problem of genes, then we get a pretty straightforward moral analysis. In that case, the responsibility lies with the medical community. This is a problem that the medical community should solve, and we should be spending NIH money to develop cures for this, and it really falls on physicians to resolve this problem. If it's a problem of the social environment, it's a little more complex. One possibility is that people are failing in their parental responsibilities, that this is actually a kind of decline in terms of the way that children are being raised. They're not being fed the proper foods, and they're not being given sufficient training or education. Another possibility is that it's the food industry that's really responsible for this, that by lots of attractive advertising, creation of foods that are very tasty and that have wonderful mouthfeel and that are hard to resist, that they have actually lured us into eating foods that have less nutritional value and are much higher in things like salt and sugar and fat, and that the social environment, we're just surrounded by bad food in a way that wasn't the case in the past. And then a final thing that gets mentioned is that somehow it's the media, and I put the media here to mean not just newspapers and television, but that there's something going on in terms of our broader cultural environment, which is encouraging us to eat more and not be particularly responsible in the kind of food choices that we make. Now, if it's parents that are the way that we unpack this social environment analysis of the cause, then it's pretty clear who's morally responsible. It's become something that parents should take responsibility for, and we're going to have a lag. We're going to have a generation who are going to experience these kinds of problems, but it ultimately is going to be a problem that only gets solved when parents take control. On the other hand, if it's the food industry or the media, then we are going to primarily look to the government to solve this problem. And we're going to look for regulations, perhaps regulations that would, at a minimum, provide much more information about the foods that we're eating, and a number of states are passing laws that require restaurants to provide more detailed dietary information and so on. Perhaps actually even intervening in things like, for example, our own domestic food aid program, which you can't use food aid dollars to spend money on alcohol or cigarettes, but you can use them to spend money on snack foods and Cheetos and Hostess Twinkies and soda pop, and so some are suggesting that we need to intervene at that kind of level, and perhaps we actually need to intervene in terms of some of the kind of messages that are circulating in our society. And then if it turns out to be individual decision making, it's really hard to know what we can do, right? What can we do other than perhaps hire professors to go out and give talks like this and stigmatize bad decision making, sort of wag my finger and tell you, you're going to go have lunch after this talk, and I don't want to see anybody eating that cheeseburger and the French fries. Get your carrots and your veggies and something like that. And perhaps that kind of stigmatization actually does suggest that government at least has a role in participating in a certain kind of lecturing on food quality. And this actually kind of brings me to my third challenge, which is kind of, how food fits broadly into our sense of culture and our identity and our understanding of who we are. Now, this is actually a problem that philosophers have spent very little time thinking about. There are extensive studies on food and culture by anthropologists who are interested in studying food practices in other countries and why people eat the kinds of things that they do and how they understand that. There's been growing work by other social scientists really trying to understand links between food and culture. And then in philosophy, we do a little bit, but it's all focused on aesthetics. It's sort of like that ancient work that we're interested in food primarily as a work of art or as a expression of creativity or the ideas of daintiness or manliness or whatever that might be associated with certain kinds of foods. Not too much that's been done within the standpoint of ethics. So I'm kind of on my own here. I don't have many shoulders to stand on. And I'm going to fall back on some work that I've done in the philosophy of agriculture, which tries to draw a contrast between two philosophical ways of thinking about the whole food system, from the beginning where you're growing food, planting food in fields, raising animals, all the way up to the consumption end. And one of them I call an industrial philosophy of food systems, whereas the other I'm calling an agrarian philosophy of agriculture, because I'm not sure how we expand this to the whole food system. So this industrial philosophy, which I could unpack at lengths that would truly bore you, I'll summarize just really in terms of this thought. That we can think of our agriculture or our entire food system just as one sector in the industrial economy. And that we have a general philosophy for how we think about the industrial economy should perform, and that we should think about the food system as living up to those norms. And I'll give you a very simple understanding of what those norms are. Norm number one is that firms in an industrial economy should produce whatever goods they're producing efficiently and competitively. They should be offering them to us at the lowest possible prices, and the way that we do that is that we create situations where the firms are competing with one another. But there is an important caveat to this, and that is, excuse me, that we think of these firms as needing to, as economists would say, internalize their costs. And what this means is that they really cannot produce in a way that allows them to achieve greater efficiencies or to succeed in competition by imposing costs on other people or harming other people. So you can't lower your price of steel by dumping all of the inconvenient byproducts into the local stream. You can't lower your cost of producing drugs by putting the waste from that production into the river or into the air. And you have to produce products that are safe and so on. So we create a set of rules for the industrial economy that put firms into a position of competing efficiently. But then we regulate. I know that's a dangerous word in some places, but we create a set of rules, the rules of the game, which is that this competition has to internalize all those costs, and it's not going to be considered fair or appropriate to gain efficiencies by imposing costs on third parties. So we can really unpack this a little bit by focusing on that word goods again and ask what makes something a good when we're thinking in this industrial mode. Well, the thing that makes something a good is just the fact that people want it, right? Goods are anything that satisfy people's preferences, anything that they're willing to pay for, anything that they desire. If getting it makes them happy, it's a good. And economically, it's that they're willing to pay for it that really matters, right? So goods are the things that we exchange in the industrial economy, and it's the things that we exchange in industrial economy that we're focusing on as needing to be produced efficiently and in ways that don't hurt other people. If we come back and we'll take a little bit of return to this obesity problem, we would actually think of this in the following way. What we really have to do in an industrial economy is just satisfy individual wants. They're going to be, people are going to be able to satisfy their preferences to the maximal extent, so long as we're not violating individual rights. And this is going to leave us with the thought that really the only possible analysis here is that it's the individuals that are responsible. And as long as the firms are playing by the rules, if you have preferences that are giving you diabetes when you hit age 35, or that are leading you to a heart attack at age 48, that's not the economy's fault, right? That's your fault, right? All of the blame really falls on you. So this industrial philosophy ties in very closely with this notion that there's nothing really socially to think about here, that this is primarily an individual decision-making kind of problem. Now, I'm not going to argue against that. My point here today is to really try to unpack some of the philosophical dimensions of this. And so in that vein, I'm going to tell a couple of stories of different ways that people have thought about agriculture and food systems in the past. And I'm going to start out with one that goes back to ancient Greece, right? I'm a philosophy professor, so I'm contractually obligated to mention ancient Greece at least 3 times in my talk. And then the second one, I'll talk about a case at the formation of the United States. So this story comes from Xenophon and Aristotle, although in fact the version that I'm going to tell you really comes from Hegel. Hegel tells this story at some length in his philosophy of history, and it's a fascinating story in its own right. Really starts out by, Hegel starts out by asking us to look at the geography of the ancient world, and we're supposed to notice that Greece is a country that is quite mountainous, but it has a number of regions where you can produce agriculturally. They're separated from one another by these mountain ranges, but they are, and this tends to create these smaller pockets of civilization, these city-states, as it was called in ancient in the ancient world, that are relatively autonomous and where and draw their food, essentially have very locally organized food systems. And Hegel follows this after discussing Egypt. This is actually a modern map of Egypt because there's no Aswan Dam in ancient Egypt. So take all of that stuff and that's still blue. But in ancient Egypt, the agricultural system, which was a marvel, relied upon the annual flood of the Nile River. So the Nile River floods, and as it comes down to the delta, it floods and covers up much of this lower level territory, and the Egyptian agricultural system relied upon an elaborate system of trapping the floodwaters of the Nile to maximize the availability of the water, and then carefully siphoning it down the river and planting crops behind it. The Nile brought in a fresh flood of nutrients, so they didn't have to add fertilizers. But the way that you essentially do this is you need a very centrally managed society. You need to have a lot of people out there building the irrigation works, maintaining the irrigation works, opening them, closing them, and doing all the field work. And those people were, of course, slaves. And then you have a very small elite class that pays attention to how all of this is managed. And those were the priests. That was what the Egyptian priests largely did. And then at the end of the day, you collect all this food and have to distribute it out, and that's all centrally done as well. And elaborate systems are created to take account of that, and Hegel actually credits the Egyptians with developing the whole idea of administration, and it leads to ideas of accounting and some of the early ideas in mathematics and so on and so forth. But they are very hierarchically organized and centrally managed society. Whereas in ancient Greece, the agriculture looks pretty different. This is a sort of a field level picture of what the agriculture in ancient Greece might have looked like. And you've got some crops growing down there on the bottomlands, annual crops that get planted every year. And as you start to move up the hill, you have sandy soils, you have a temperate climate, you're able to grow some vines, and you're able to harvest some grapes. You also have some olive trees as you move a little bit farther up the hill. And then you're also able to put some livestock, sheep and goats primarily, that would be wandering around, particularly under the trees. And then after you've harvested your fields down at the bottom, you can turn your livestock loose in there, and they'll fertilize the fields, and they'll eat the leavings after the harvest. And this is a system, unlike this massive army that it takes to manage the Egyptian system, that's ideally managed by a single household. The single household in Greece would have included a landowner and his family. It probably would have included a few slaves, but these would have been slaves that would have been entrusted with quite a bit of responsibility in the work, and would have looked rather different from the kind of slavery that existed in ancient Egypt. I'm not going to try to defend slavery here, and I do want you to notice that there are slaves in this system, but it's largely a household management. There's something, chores change as the seasons change. You go get your crops in, there's nothing to do with the crops, then you can go prune your grape trees, then you can focus on your trees and managing your livestock. You go, devote all your labor to harvesting the crop. There's something going on at every stage of the year, and so you can keep a household labor fleet busy, and that becomes a very stable agriculture. The Greeks, however, did have a system of governance which involved, again, the male, there's sexism in ancient Greece too, going into the city and, undertaking the various tasks of commerce and exchange and governance that occurred in each of these city-states. And part of the thing that the cities were focused on was this possibility that people from outside Greece would look at their society and decide, gee, we'd like to have that. And so they would organize these gigantic armies that would threaten the Greek agriculture. Anybody in here seen, what's the movie recently? I should know this as a Michigan State Spartan, but was it 300? Something like that. So at any rate, you know, you have to defend yourself against the Persians, usually is who it is, right? The Persians come in, they'll burn down your crops, right? That's a problem. Nobody likes to have their crops burned down. But you can plant those crops again next year. The real problem comes when they start cutting down your vines and your trees because it takes a lifetime to essentially develop the kind of agriculture that becomes symptomatic of ancient Greece. And so this creates a situation in which the heads of these households are quite willing to participate in the defense of the society. If you're a slave in ancient Egypt, you don't really have a lot of incentive to defend ancient Egypt, right? That's, you know, you're glad when somebody comes in and takes over that system, right? But these householders are out there, they need to protect their agriculture, and so they actually participate in these local systems of governance, and they also develop a particular form of response to these threats that becomes the most potent force for warfare, for defense in the ancient world, and actually drives ancient Greece to the top of the heap in terms of the ancient world. So Hegel's point is that what happens is that the ancient Greeks develop a strong sense of citizenship. They understand themselves as citizens of these states. You don't see that happening in ancient Egypt. They develop a strong sense of solidarity with one another. This particular military form depends upon each soldier feeling like they have absolute confidence in the person that's serving next to them. That's not a person that's going to abandon them in the middle of the night, seeking some employer that's willing to pay them a little bit more to wield their sword. These are all people that are there to defend their way of life. And so they have a sense of political community. And Hegel's argument is that this is really the first time that this sense of political community that can give rise to virtues such as loyalty or courage or friendship arises. I mean, Hegel may have been wrong about that, but his general point was that you have a kind of moral sense of community and political loyalty that actually depends on the system of agriculture. That's Hegel's story. So let's take a look at our story here in the United States. This story focuses on Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, both of whom were serving in the cabinet of George Washington. And they are facing a decision as to, the United States doesn't have a lot of money at this point. It's a brand new nation. They've also just successfully thrown out the British. But in the process of throwing out the British, they've seen a lot of people leave, right? I mean, if you're sitting there facing the Revolutionary War, do you want to enlist and fight, or is it better to maybe pull up stakes and head to Canada or down to the Bahamas or someplace where the British are still in control? And Hamilton and Jefferson have a debate about how the United States should plan its course of development. And basically Hamilton's idea is that we should build factories in New Jersey and start to compete with the Europeans for textile manufacturing. And Jefferson's idea is, no, let's build farms, and we'll send our cotton and what all to Europe, and they can mill it into clothing, but we'll focus on increasing our land base and invest in farms. Hamilton's argument was we need to be industrially independent. These British are making a ton with their textile factories. We can make money doing this as well. Jefferson's argument is that no, when we faced this problem in the Revolutionary War, who was it that showed up to fight? Who was it that became part of the army? Who was it that felt like they had a commitment to the United States or to America as a political community? It was the farmers, and they did it for basically the same reasons that the ancient Greeks did it, right? If you were making rum in Boston and the war breaks out, you can make rum in Montreal or in Freeport, right? So you pick up your rum making and you hightail it, and manufacturers tended not to stick around. They tended not to support the United States as an emerging economy. But if you're a farmer and you're developing your land and you're putting your identity into this land that you're developing, you're building fences and barns and so on, then you've got to stick around and make the new society work. So Jefferson's argument was that's where we should go. Now, the short story about how this turned out is that Alexander Hamilton got himself into a duel with Aaron Burr and was killed, right? So that settled the debate, perhaps not on its merits, whereas Jefferson went on to become the third president and negotiated the Louisiana Purchase and was basically able to put his plan into place, and we get launched on history in which agriculture actually is an important part of our national story. And if you're interested in that, you can buy my book. What I really want to do now is kind of, pull back from this a little bit and ask just, do these agrarian stories have any kind of salience to us today? And I'm wondering whether or not, we could actually today, I don't know that we need to tell the kind of story that Hegel told. We're now a society where only 2% of our population actually are farmers. If we really need to have a significant percentage of our people in farming to have this sense of community that Jefferson was interested in, we're basically screwed. But maybe we could tell different kinds of agrarian stories, and that we could think about our food system as having resonance in our personal identities and in our community identity, the kind of thing that pulls us together into a community that's able to tackle problems together in an organized way. And one way to think about that particularly in developing countries, might be that as we've moved into this more industrial organized food system, we've tended to see the high value crops and the high value foods, the ones that the industrial society will promote and develop. And perhaps we should think about, we've actually seen in almost every case that this has happened, that there actually is a decline in the diversity of foods that people are eating, and that maybe some of the problems that we see in terms of obesity might be resolved by growing more diverse crops and actually having a more biologically diverse agriculture that would be available. We also can ask about whether or not it's really such a good idea to get that 50% of people who are farmers out of farming and put them into urban environments where they're still going to be in extreme poverty. Maybe the fact that they are farmers and that they're doing something, that they're entrepreneurs of a certain sort, that they're, even though they're very poor, that they have a certain sort of stake in their place and in their land that really is important to try to maintain. And perhaps we could think about food cultures that would actually go back to some of these other virtues of temperance, and ask whether there would be contemporary equivalents to that. I do have to admit, though, that in some respects this word agrarian is itself, kind of the problem. We just don't think in that kind of way anymore. We don't think in ways, our public discourse doesn't really focus on ways in which our material practices actually reinforce or cultivate certain notions of virtue. This is actually not, you don't actually hear any of the presidential candidates talking about the way that material practices cultivate notions of virtue, right? And I'm not not, I mean, we are listening to a lot of Republicans right now, but this isn't just a problem for the Republicans. This political discourse is just not really available to us anymore. It was very persuasive in Jefferson's time, but Jefferson praised farmers as being the best citizens and was able to make this link between farming and citizenship in very succinct ways, and it resonated. People understood what he was talking about. But we don't really seem to have that vocabulary anymore. We really seem to have lost that. So maybe we need to drop the agrarian and figure out some other way to talk about that. I don't have the answer to that problem. So I'll sum up here by talking about, by just sort of suggesting what each of my three challenges are. First, we note that the food entitlements of rural and urban poor are sometimes, actually often, in conflict, and that the policy responses that we've undertaken in the West have encouraged overproduction of agricultural commodities, and it also may have actually skewed the selection of the crops that we produce and the foods that we eat. The second challenge is that we have a historically unprecedented rate of availability of food, and this is coupled with rising overconsumption and attendant health problems. Yet we seem to lack any appropriate way to frame this problem as something that we can get a handle on. It always seems to come back to just wagging our fingers at one another and lecturing one another. And then challenge number three, farming and food production aren't really salient social practices anymore. We can't really talk about farming and food production and use these as examples or ways of talking about who we are as a people or what pulls us together as a community. And these old philosophical accounts of the virtues were linked to quotidian practices, things that people do every day without really thinking about them in any kind of deep philosophical way. But that really lacks resonance in our society. Yet I would argue that clearly we need moral and political reforms that are associated with the more industrial notions of rights and social welfare. I'm not suggesting we get rid of the industrial vision. So what I want to suggest is that when we look at the policy responses to problem number one, it actually has led in some respects to some of the things that we observe in number two. When we notice that we seem to lack a kind of appropriate moral vocabulary, that actually ties us down to some of the changes that we've experienced in terms of challenge number three, that a whole ways of linking our daily practices to notions of virtue seem to lack salience in our contemporary world. And so that actually ties all of these together. Now that's a very impressionistic account, but I've kept everybody here by far long enough, and so I'll stop at that point. Thank you. Okay, 15 minutes. You can't leave if you're getting this for credit. Anybody, I'll be happy to. Yeah.
One floor below us, there's what's called the Commons. The whole area where people eat and where the food was prepared and sold used to be called the Commons. Now the preparation and sale of the food goes on in what's called a food court, which has some symbolic appropriateness, I think. We also across campus have what's called the food zoo, which is mostly for the students who live in dormitories. Are you aware of any efforts around the country to change the way these places work and to change the social habits on university campuses and high school and grade school campuses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just mention some things that are going on at Michigan State. We have a vice president for some long thing that has to do with how students live, who has really taken this on in a big way, and he's approaching it dorm by dorm, right? So, we haven't had any changes in our big, the equivalent to this building, right? There we have food courts very much like yours, but we also have a lot of dining halls that operate out of the residential complexes. And so what he has done is he's actually now created 2 of the dining halls in residential complexes that really focus on food, community, health related kinds of themes. So, they're very careful about, what they select. These are, these standard kinds of dining experiences where you pay a price and then you can go anywhere in the dining hall. They're linked to, we actually have, of course, have farms at Michigan State. So some of this is being grown on our organic farm. We also have links to other kinds of local suppliers. So there's a kind of local cultural theme, and there's also a lot of focus on diet, and also a lot of focus on managing the waste that comes out of these facilities. So they actually kind of use this now as a recruiting tool, right? So students can come to Michigan State, they can choose whatever dorm they want to live in. They aren't forced into one of these dorms where we have this more, kind of true commons notion of what the food practices there are. But part of the reason that we now have 2 of these dorms is the first one was so popular that it was immediately oversubscribed. So he's willing to convert as many of these dorms over as we can get students to elect living in this kind of environment. I've seen similar kind of things at some other campuses I've visited. At the opposite end of the, we have over 40,000 students at Michigan State, but at the opposite end of the spectrum is Green Mountain College in Vermont. Little tiny college, I think something like 800 students. They have a farm. They are doing similar kinds of things in terms of pulling things into their dining hall. They're actually working closely with local dairy farmers, and they are hoping, I think by about now, to have gone completely off the grid, and they're going to produce all the power that the university needs from cow manure that they get from local farmers. And they've sort of made these notions of sustainability into the theme of the entire campus. And, they actually, the agrarian vision is taught at Green Mountain College. So I do think that there's a lot of different ways to go with this. You can sort of focus on the health themes, you can focus on the local community things, you can focus on the environmental impact. I think that ideally you do all of those things and then try to think about how they might be connected with one another. And they aren't necessarily easy to connect. I mean, sometimes the thing that is great for local community development is not so great environmentally, and vice versa. So one of the things that's, I think, particularly interesting about Green Mountain is that that we haven't done at Michigan State, is that they've actually built this into their curriculum, right? So they're thinking and talking reflectively about what's going on in terms of the campus practices to try to become more sustainable in the classroom. And the instructors have really tried to, kind of use the student living experience as an important part of the curriculum as well.
Are you aware of efforts to change social patterns beyond just the emphasis on the food? Because it would make a difference if occasionally, at least, students were having meals with faculty members.
Sure, yeah. Well, that actually is happening at Green Mountain, not at Michigan State so much. I mean, I actually do go over to one of these dorms and eat and meet students over there, and it's okay, but it's not like, with 40,000 students, it's not like I run into very many students I know very often. But yeah, let me take another question. Yes.
In terms of larger solutions or paradigm shifts, do you think that it'll come from these kind of what you're mentioning, bottom-up, community-driven sort of actions, or do you think that it'll eventually have to come from a policy, structural, more top-down?
Well, I think that policy top-down stuff only works when you have a strong sense of community and of common fate, right? If you think of, the government as some remote entity that is just telling you what to do or setting the rules, certain kinds of policies, you sort of grudgingly acknowledge that, yeah, we got to have that. Some of them are inconvenient for you, and you may not really understand that there's a rationale, and plenty of them are just they're just not good policies, right? So the prerequisite for having the top down is having enough of a sense of community, having the sense that people feel like they're citizens. I mean, that's part of what I really take from Jefferson, part of Jefferson's real wisdom, that sustainability means that you have an investment and a sense of participation in your society, in your community. You think of your society as your community. And I think one of the reasons why food is a very appropriate place to begin is that I think that we sell food short as a potential source of community. It's not something that we typically debate about philosophically. As Dane said, I really am kind of a weirdo in the philosophical tradition for thinking about this kind of stuff. But what's unique about food is that we all eat, we all do it. At least ideally we do it every day, usually a couple of times a day. We can talk with one another about it. There's a lot of implicit ethical value that is embedded in our food practices for good and for ill. Focusing on food is actually a very natural way for us to start to explore where we actually might build community. Partly that means, hey, let's go out and get something healthy and tasty, but it also means having respect for different values, right? I mean, we need to be able to respect people who have food traditions that might be ethnically or personally or historically important to them. So we can actually, work our way through notions of mutual respect, and hey, we don't all have to eat the same thing every day as part of our food culture. So I think it's a good lab for doing some of this, and it's not something where you have to have had a lot of philosophy courses to participate in those conversations. So let me go way to the back, and then I'll.
With regards to your control on obesity, particularly the food industry there and the media, how can you expect the government to have regulations on that whenever the food industry is such a large contributor to the lobbying money that goes to the federal government?
Well, I think that your point's well taken. I certainly know that agencies within the government are exploring ways in which they could be more proactive. I actually gave a talk at the Centers for Disease Control last summer and met with a number of their policy group, and they're very interested in where they can intervene, but they're also keenly aware of the limitations of what they can do, and they're also keenly aware that they could overstep their authority, and they could also really irritate not just the food industry, but other sources of support. Even within the food industry, though, there's a mix. The food industry isn't monolithic, and some firms are more willing to undertake these kinds of changes than others. I mean, at the end of the day, they aren't really interested in giving you diabetes. They just want to make a buck. And if they can figure out how to do that, they're quite willing to make some changes. Yeah.
Would you answer a question about the industrial ethic?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about what you put up on the board or on the slide, and I was kind of wondering, how do we hold companies kind of responsible for the need for them to kind of play fair? And I'm wondering if, what things do companies need to do in order to be playing fair so that we can blame the individual for their choices? And I think it comes down to, if you're making choices to cut the cost of your product by replacing real maple syrup with high fructose corn syrup, or if you're not reporting the ingredients or the way that they were farmed.
Right.
To what extent can we blame the individual if they don't know what's in the food that they're eating?
So, I didn't have a lot of time to unpack the industrial ethic, and one of the things that I didn't do was to really talk about some of the strengths of the industrial ethic. It really does give us some very potent tools for thinking about the economy the way that the economy works, and for responding to a whole set of social problems. And this idea that you have a right to certain kinds of information is very compatible with an industrial conception of how the food system should work. And it is, in fact, the way that agencies such as the CDC are kind of thinking. They're very focused on information programs and actually requiring. Right now it's FDA that writes the rules about what actually, the little label on your can of peas that talks about how much sodium it has and, serving size and calories and so on. But they're working with people at FDA to think about, whether or not other kinds of information would be useful to require. I mean, they're approaching that responsibly. It costs money to put information on products, and it also, you can have too much information, right? I mean, has anybody looked at a carton of Ben & Jerry's lately and seen their explanation of BST? That's actually, it's about a paragraph long, and they have to, explain that their cows don't get BST, but they can't be sure that the people that make their chocolate aren't using milk from cows that gets BST, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's way too much information for anybody who's wanting some ice cream, right? So these are difficult problems to sort out, but thinking about what kind of information people are entitled to and how to structure information certainly would be a way of pushing forward that is something the government can do, but that actually facilitates individual decision making and probably doesn't really constrain individual decision making in too severe a manner. Have I used up all my time? Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.